Section 57 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant, Chapter 57. Raid on the Virginia Central Railroad. Raid on the Weldon Railroad. Early's movement upon Washington. Mining the works before Petersburg. Explosion of the mine before Petersburg. Campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. Capture of the Weldon Railroad. On the 7th of June, while at Cold Harbor, I had, as already indicated, sent Sheridan with 2 divisions of cavalry to destroy as much as he could of the Virginia Central Railroad. General Hunter had been operating up the Shenandoah Valley with some success, having fought a battle near Staunton, where he captured a great many prisoners, besides killing and wounding a good many men. After the battle he formed a junction at Staunton with Averill and Crook, who had come up from the Kanawha or Gauley River. It was supposed, therefore, that General Hunter would be about Charlottesville, Virginia, by the time Sheridan could get there, doing on the way the damage that he was sent to do. I gave Sheridan instructions to have Hunter, in case he should meet him about Charlottesville, join and return with him to the Army of the Potomac. Lee, hearing of Hunter's success in the valley, started Breckinridge out for its defence at once. Learning later of Sheridan's going with 2 divisions, he also sent Hampton with 2 divisions of cavalry, his own and Fitzhugh Lee's. Sheridan moved to the north side of the North Anna to get out west, and learned of the movement of these troops to the south side of the same stream almost as soon as they had started. He pushed on to get to Trevilian Station, to commence his destruction at that point. On the night of the 10th he bivouacked some 6 or 7 miles east of Trevilian, while Fitzhugh Lee was the same night at Trevilian Station, and Hampton but a few miles away. During the night Hampton ordered an advance on Sheridan, hoping, no doubt, to surprise and very badly cripple him. Sheridan, however, by a counter move sent Custer on a rapid march to get between the 2 divisions of the enemy and into their rear. This he did successfully, so that at daylight, when the assault was made, the enemy found himself at the same time resisted in front and attacked in rear, and broke in some confusion. The losses were probably very light on both sides in killed and wounded, but Sheridan got away with some 500 prisoners and sent them to City Point. During that day, the 11th, Sheridan moved into Trevilian Station, and the following day proceeded to tear up the road east and west. There was considerable fighting during the whole of the day, but the work of destruction went on. In the meantime, at night, the enemy had taken possession of the crossing which Sheridan had proposed to take to go north when he left Trevilian. Sheridan learned, however, from some of the prisoners he had captured here, that General Hunter was about Lynchburg, and therefore that there was no use of his going on to Charlottesville with a view to meet him. Sheridan started back during the night of the 12th, and made his way north and farther east, coming around by the north side of White House and arriving there on the 21st. Here he found an abundance of forage for his animals, food for his men, and security while resting. He had been obliged to leave about 90 of his own men in the field hospital which he had established near Trevilian, and these necessarily fell into the hands of the enemy. White House up to this time had been a depot, but now that our troops were all on the James River, it was no longer wanted as a store of supplies. Sheridan was, therefore, directed to break it up, which he did on the 22d of June, bringing the garrison and an immense wagon train with him. All these were over the James River by the 26th of the month, and Sheridan ready to follow. In the meantime, Meade had sent Wilson's division on a raid to destroy the Weldon and South Side roads. Now that Sheridan was safe and Hampton free to return to Richmond with his cavalry, Wilson's position became precarious. Meade, therefore, on the 27th, ordered Sheridan over the river to make a demonstration in favor of Wilson. Wilson got back, though not without severe loss, having struck both roads, but the damage done was soon repaired. After these events, comparative quiet reigned about Petersburg until late in July. The time, however, was spent in strengthening the intrenchments and making our position generally more secure against a sudden attack. In the meantime I had to look after other portions of my command, where things had not been going on so favorably always as I could have wished. General Hunter, who had been appointed to succeed Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley, immediately took up the offensive. He met the enemy on the 5th of June at Piedmont and defeated him. On the 8th he formed a junction with Crook and Averell at Staunton, from which place he moved direct on Lynchburg via Lexington, which he reached and invested on the 16th. Up to this time he was very successful, and but for the difficulty of taking with him sufficient ordnance stores over so long a march through a hostile country, he would, no doubt, have captured Lynchburg. The destruction of the enemy's supplies and manufactories had been very great. To meet this movement under General Hunter, General Lee sent Early with his corps, a part of which reached Lynchburg before Hunter. After some skirmishing on the 17th and 18th, General Hunter, owing to a want of ammunition to give battle, retired from before the place. Unfortunately, this want of ammunition left him no choice of route for his return but by the way of the Gauley and Kanawha rivers, thence up the Ohio River, returning to Harper's Ferry by way of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. A long time was consumed in making this movement. Meantime the valley was left open to Early's troops and others in that quarter, and Washington also was uncovered. Early took advantage of this condition of affairs and moved on Washington. In the absence of Hunter, General Lew Wallace, with headquarters at Baltimore, commanded the department in which the Shenandoah lay. His surplus of troops with which to move against the enemy was small in number. Most of these were raw and consequently very much inferior to our veterans and to the veterans which Early had with him. But the situation of Washington was precarious, and Wallace moved with commendable promptitude to meet the enemy at the Monocacy. He could hardly have expected to defeat him badly, but he hoped to cripple and delay him until Washington could be put into a state of preparation for his reception. I had previously ordered General Meade to send a division to Baltimore for the purpose of adding to the defences of Washington, and he had sent Ricketts' division of the 6th Corps, Wright's, which arrived in Baltimore on the 8th of July. Finding that Wallace had gone to the front with his command, Ricketts immediately took the cars and followed him to the Monocacy with his entire division. They met the enemy and, as might have been expected, were defeated. But they succeeded in stopping him for the day on which the battle took place. The next morning Early started on his march to the capital of the nation, arriving before it on the 11th. Learning of the gravity of the situation, I had directed General Meade to also order Wright, with the rest of his corps, directly to Washington for the relief of that place, and the latter reached there the very day that Early arrived before it. The 19th corps, which had been stationed in Louisiana, having been ordered up to reinforce the armies about Richmond, had about this time arrived at Fortress Monroe, on their way to join us. I diverted them from that point to Washington, which place they reached almost simultaneously with Wright on the 11th. The 19th corps was commanded by Major General Emory. Early made his reconnoissance with a view of attacking on the following morning, the 12th. But the next morning he found our intrenchments, which were very strong, fully manned. He at once commenced to retreat, Wright following. There is no telling how much this result was contributed to by General Lew Wallace's leading what might well be considered almost a forlorn hope. If Early had been but one day earlier he might have entered the capital before the arrival of the reinforcements I had sent. Whether the delay caused by the battle amounted to a day or not, General Wallace contributed on this occasion, by the defeat of the troops under him, a greater benefit to the cause than often falls to the lot of a commander of an equal force to render by means of a victory. Farther west also the troubles were threatening. Some time before, Forrest had met Sturgis in command of some of our cavalry in Mississippi, and handled him very roughly, gaining a very great victory over him. This left Forrest free to go almost where he pleased, and to cut the roads in rear of Sherman, who was then advancing. Sherman was abundantly able to look after the army that he was immediately with, and all of his military divisions, so long as he could communicate with it. But it was my place to see that he had the means with which to hold his rear. Two divisions under A. J. Smith had been sent to Banks in Louisiana some months before. Sherman ordered these back, with directions to attack Forrest. Smith met and defeated him very badly. I then directed that Smith should hang to Forrest and not let him go, and to prevent by all means his getting upon the Memphis and Nashville Railroad. Sherman had anticipated me in this matter, and given the same order in substance, but receiving my directions for this order to Smith, he repeated it. On the 25th of June General Burnside had commenced running a mine from about the centre of his front under the Confederate works confronting him. He was induced to do this by Colonel Pleasants of the Pennsylvania Volunteers, whose regiment was mostly composed of miners, and who was himself a practical miner. Burnside had submitted the scheme to Meade and myself, and we both approved of it, as a means of keeping the men occupied. His position was very favorable for carrying on this work, but not so favorable for the operations to follow its completion. The position of the two lines at that point were only about 100 yards apart, with a comparatively deep ravine intervening. In the bottom of this ravine the work commenced. The position was unfavorable in this particular, that the enemy's line at that point was re-entering, so that its front was commanded by their own lines both to the right and left. Then, too, the ground was sloping upward back of the Confederate line for a considerable distance, and it was presumable that the enemy had, at least, a detached work on this highest point. The work progressed, and on the 23d of July the mine was finished ready for charging, but I had this work of charging deferred until we were ready for it. On the 17th of July several deserters came in and said that there was great consternation in Richmond, and that Lee was coming out to make an attack upon us, the object being to put us on the defensive so that he might detach troops to go to Georgia, where the army Sherman was operating against was said to be in great trouble. I put the army commanders, Meade and Butler, on the lookout, but the attack was not made. I concluded then, a few days later, to do something in the way of offensive movement myself, having in view something of the same object that Lee had had. Wright's and Emory's corps were in Washington, and with this reduction of my force Lee might very readily have spared some troops from the defences to send west. I had other objects in view, however, besides keeping Lee where he was. The mine was constructed and ready to be exploded, and I wanted to take that occasion to carry Petersburg if I could. It was the object, therefore, to get as many of Lee's troops away from the south side of the James River as possible. Accordingly, on the 26th we commenced a movement with Hancock's corps and Sheridan's cavalry to the north side by the way of Deep Bottom, where Butler had a pontoon bridge laid. The plan, in the main, was to let the cavalry cut loose, and, joining with Kautz's cavalry of the Army of the James, get by Lee's lines and destroy as much as they could of the Virginia Central Railroad, while, in the meantime, the infantry was to move out so as to protect their rear and cover their retreat back when they should have got through with their work. We were successful in drawing the enemy's troops to the north side of the James as I expected. The mine was ordered to be charged, and the morning of the 30th of July was the time fixed for its explosion. I gave Meade minute orders on the 24th directing how I wanted the assault conducted, which orders he amplified into general instructions for the guidance of the troops that were to be engaged. Meade's instructions, which I, of course, approved most heartily, were all that I can see now was necessary. The only further precaution which he could have taken, and which he could not foresee, would have been to have different men to execute them. The gallery to the mine was over 500 feet long from where it entered the ground to the point where it was under the enemy's works, and with a cross gallery of something over 80 feet running under their lines. 8 chambers had been left, requiring a ton of powder each to charge them. All was ready by the time I had prescribed, and on the 29th Hancock and Sheridan were brought back near the James River with their troops. Under cover of night they started to recross the bridge at Deep Bottom, and to march directly for that part of our lines in front of the mine. Warren was to hold his line of intrenchments with a sufficient number of men, and concentrate the balance on the right next to Burnside's corps, while Ord, now commanding the 18th corps, temporarily under Meade, was to form in the rear of Burnside to support him when he went in. All were to clear off the parapets and the abatis in their front, so as to leave the space as open as possible, and be able to charge the moment the mine had been sprung and Burnside had taken possession. Burnside's corps was not to stop in the crater at all, but push on to the top of the hill, supported on the right and left by Ord's and Warren's corps. Warren and Ord fulfilled their instructions perfectly so far as making ready was concerned, Burnside seemed to have paid no attention whatever to the instructions, and left all the obstructions in his own front for his troops to get over in the best way they could. The four divisions of his corps were commanded by Generals Potter, Wilcox, Ledlie, and Ferraro. The last was a colored division, and Burnside selected it to make the assault. Meade interfered with this. Burnside then took Ledlie's division, a worse selection than the first could have been. In fact, Potter and Wilcox were the only division commanders Burnside had who were equal to the occasion. Ledlie, besides being otherwise inefficient, proved also to possess disqualifications less common among soldiers. There was some delay about the explosion of the mine, so that it did not go off until about 5 o'clock in the morning. When it did explode, it was very successful, making a crater 20 feet deep and something like 100 feet in length. Instantly 110 cannon and 50 mortars, which had been placed in the most commanding positions covering the ground to the right and left of where the troops were to enter the enemy lines, commenced playing. Ledlie's division marched into the crater immediately on the explosion, but most of the men stopped there in the absence of any one to give directions, their commander having found some safe retreat to get into before they started. There was some delay on the left and right in advancing, but some of the troops did get in and turn to the right and left, carrying the rifle pits as I expected they would do. There had been great consternation in Petersburg, as we were well aware, about a rumored mine that we were going to explode. They knew we were mining, and they had failed to cut our mine off by countermining, though Beauregard had taken the precaution to run up a line of intrenchments to the rear of that part of their line fronting where they could see that our men were at work. We had learned through deserters who had come in that the people had very wild rumors about what was going on our side. They said that we had undermined the whole of Petersburg, that they were resting upon a slumbering volcano, and did not know at what moment they might expect an eruption. I somewhat based my calculations upon this state of feeling, and expected that when the mine was exploded the troops to the right and left would flee in all directions, and that our troops, if they moved promptly, could get in and strengthen themselves before the enemy had come to a realization of the true situation. It was just as I expected it would be. We could see the men running without any apparent object except to get away. It was half an hour before musketry firing to amount to anything was opened upon our men in the crater. It was an hour before the enemy got artillery up to play upon them, and it was 9 o'clock before Lee got up reinforcements from his right to join in expelling our troops. The effort was a stupendous failure. It cost us about 4,000 men, mostly, however, captured, and all due to inefficiency on the part of the corps commander and the incompetency of the division commander who was sent to lead the assault. After being fully assured of the failure of the mine, and finding that most of that part of Lee's army which had been drawn north of the James River were still there, I gave Meade directions to send a corps of infantry and the cavalry next morning, before Lee could get his forces back, to destroy 15 or 20 miles of the Weldon Railroad. But misfortunes never come singly. I learned during that same afternoon that Wright's pursuit of Early was feeble because of the constant and contrary orders he had been receiving from Washington, while I was cut off from immediate communication by reason of our cable across Chesapeake Bay being broken. Early, however, was not aware of the fact that Wright was not pursuing until he had reached Strasburg. Finding that he was not pursued, he turned back to Winchester, where Crook was stationed with a small force, and drove him out. He then pushed north until he had reached the Potomac. Then he sent McCausland across to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to destroy that town. Chambersburg was a purely defenseless town with no garrison whatever and no fortifications. Yet McCausland, under Early's orders, burned the place and left about 300 families homeless. This occurred on the 30th of July. I rescinded my orders for the troops to go out to destroy the Weldon Railroad, and directed them to embark for Washington City. After burning Chambersburg, McCausland retreated, pursued by our cavalry, towards Cumberland. They were met and defeated by General Kelley and driven into Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley was very important to the Confederates, because it was the principal storehouse they now had for feeding their armies about Richmond. It was well known that they would make a desperate struggle to maintain it. It had been the source of a great deal of trouble to us heretofore to guard that outlet to the north, partly because of the incompetency of some of the commanders, but chiefly because of interference from Washington. It seemed to be the policy of General Halleck and Secretary Stanton to keep any force sent there, in pursuit of the invading army, moving right and left so as to keep between the enemy and our capital, and, generally speaking, they pursued this policy until all knowledge of the whereabouts of the enemy was lost. They were left, therefore, free to supply themselves with horses, beef cattle, and such provisions as they could carry away from western Maryland and Pennsylvania. I determined to put a stop to this. I started Sheridan at once for that field of operation, and on the following day sent another division of his cavalry. I had previously asked to have Sheridan assigned to that command, but Mr. Stanton objected on the ground that he was too young for so important a command. On the 1st of August, when I sent reinforcements for the protection of Washington, I sent the following orders: City Point, Virginia, August 1st, 1864, 11:30 A.M. Major General Halleck, Washington, D.C. I am sending General Sheridan for temporary duty whilst the enemy is being expelled from the border. Unless General Hunter is in the field in person, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field, with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Wherever the enemy goes, let our troops go also. Once started up the valley, they ought to be followed until we get possession of the Virginia Central Railroad. If General Hunter is in the field, give Sheridan direct command of the 6th Corps and Cavalry Division. All the cavalry, I presume, will reach Washington in the course of tomorrow. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. The President, in some way or other, got to see this dispatch of mine directing certain instructions to be given to the commanders in the field operating against Early, and sent me the following very characteristic dispatch: Office, U.S. Military Telegraph, War Department, Washington, D.C., August 3, 1864. Cipher, 6 P.M. Lieutenant General Grant, City Point, Virginia. I have seen your dispatch, in which you say, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field, with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Wherever the enemy goes, let our troops go also." This, I think, is exactly right as to how our forces should move. But please look over the dispatches you may have received from here, even since you made that order, and discover, if you can, that there is any idea in the head of any one here of putting our army south of the enemy, or of following him to the death in any direction. I repeat to you, it will neither be done nor attempted unless you watch it every day and hour and force it. Abraham Lincoln. I replied to this that I would start in 2 hours for Washington, and soon got off, going directly to the Monocacy without stopping at Washington on my way. I found General Hunter's army encamped there, scattered over the fields along the banks of the Monocacy, with many hundreds of cars and locomotives belonging to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which he had taken the precaution to bring back and collect at that point. I asked the general where the enemy was. He replied that he did not know. He said the fact was that he was so embarrassed with orders from Washington moving him first to the right and then to the left, that he had lost all trace of the enemy. I then told the general that I would find out where the enemy was, and at once ordered steam got up and the trains made up, giving directions to push for Halltown, some 4 miles above Harper's Ferry in the Shenandoah Valley. The cavalry and the wagon trains were to march, but all the troops that could be transported by the cars were to go in that way. I knew that the valley was of such importance to the enemy that, no matter how much he was scattered at that time, he would in very short time be found in front of our troops moving south. I then wrote out General Hunter's instructions. I told him that Sheridan was in Washington, and still another division was on its way, and suggested that he establish the headquarters of the department at any point that would suit him best, Cumberland, Baltimore, or elsewhere, and give Sheridan command of the troops in the field. The general replied to this that he thought he had better be relieved entirely. He said that General Halleck seemed so much to distrust his fitness for the position he was in that he thought somebody else ought to be there. He did not want in any way to embarrass the cause, thus showing a patriotism that was none too common in the army. There were not many major generals who would voluntarily have asked to have the command of a department taken from them on the supposition that for some particular reason, or for any reason, the service would be better performed. I told him very well then, and telegraphed at once for Sheridan to come to the Monocacy, and suggested that I would wait and meet him there. Sheridan came at once by special train, but reached there after the troops were all off. I went to the station and remained there until he arrived. Myself and 1 or 2 of my staff were about all the Union people, except General Hunter and his staff, who were left at the Monocacy when Sheridan arrived. I hastily told Sheridan what had been done and what I wanted him to do, giving him at the same time the written instructions which had been prepared for General Hunter and directed to that officer. Sheridan now had about 30,000 men to move with, 8,000 of them being cavalry. Early had about the same number, but the superior ability of the National commander over the Confederate commander was so great that all the latter's advantage of being on the defensive was more than counterbalanced by this circumstance. as I had predicted, Early was soon found in front of Sheridan in the valley, and Pennsylvania and Maryland were speedily freed from the invaders. The importance of the valley was so great to the Confederates that Lee reinforced Early, but not to the extent that we thought and feared he would. To prevent, as much as possible, these reinforcements from being sent out from Richmond, I had to do something to compel Lee to retain his forces about his capital. I therefore gave orders for another move to the north side of the James River, to threaten Richmond. Hancock's corps, part of the 10th Corps under Birney, and Gregg's division of cavalry were crossed to the north side of the James during the night of the 13th 14th of August. A threatening position was maintained for a number of days, with more or less skirmishing and some tolerably hard fighting, although it was my object and my instructions that anything like a battle should be avoided, unless opportunities should present themselves which would insure great success. General Meade was left in command of the few troops around Petersburg, strongly intrenched, and was instructed to keep a close watch upon the enemy in that quarter, and himself to take advantage of any weakening that might occur through an effort on the part of the enemy to reinforce the north side. There was no particular victory gained on either side, but during that time no more reinforcements were sent to the valley. I informed Sheridan of what had been done to prevent reinforcements being sent from Richmond against him, and also that the efforts we had made had proven that one of the divisions which we supposed had gone to the valley was still at Richmond, because we had captured 600 or 700 prisoners from that division, each of its 4 brigades having contributed to our list of captures. I also informed him that but one division had gone, and it was possible that I should be able to prevent the going of any more. To add to my embarrassment at this time, Sherman, who was now near Atlanta, wanted reinforcements. He was perfectly willing to take the raw troops then being raised in the Northwest, saying that he could teach them more soldiering in one day among his troops than they would learn in a week in a camp of instruction. I therefore asked that all troops in camps of instruction in the Northwest be sent to him. Sherman also wanted to be assured that no Eastern troops were moving out against him. I informed him of what I had done, and assured him that I would hold all the troops there that it was possible for me to hold, and that up to that time none had gone. I also informed him that his real danger was from Kirby Smith, who commanded the Trans-Mississippi Department. If Smith should escape Steele and get across the Mississippi River, he might move against him. I had therefore asked to have an expedition ready to move from New Orleans against Mobile in case Kirby Smith should get across. This would have a tendency to draw him to the defence of that place instead of going against Sherman. Right in the midst of all these embarrassments, Halleck informed me that there was an organized scheme on foot in the North to resist the draft, and suggested that it might become necessary to draw troops from the field to put it down. He also advised taking in sail and not going too fast. The troops were withdrawn from the north side of the James River on the night of the 20th. Before they were withdrawn, however, and while most of Lee's force was on that side of the river, Warren had been sent with most of the 5th Corps to capture the Weldon Railroad. He took up his line of march well back to the rear, south of the enemy, while the troops remaining in the trenches extended so as to cover that part of the line which he had vacated by moving out. From our left, near the old line, it was about 3 miles to the Weldon Railroad. A division was ordered from the right of the Petersburg line to reinforce Warren, while a division was brought back from the north side of the James River to take its place. This road was very important to the enemy. The limits from which his supplies had been drawn were already very much contracted, and I knew that he must fight desperately to protect it. Warren carried the road, though with heavy loss on both sides. He fortified his new position, and our trenches were then extended from the left of our main line to connect with his new one. Lee made repeated attempts to dislodge Warren's corps, but without success and with heavy loss. As soon as Warren was fortified and reinforcements reached him, troops were sent south to destroy the bridges on the Weldon Railroad, and with such success that the enemy had to draw in wagons for a distance of about 30 miles all the supplies they got thereafter from that source. It was on the 21st that Lee seemed to have given up the Weldon Railroad as having been lost to him. But along about the 24th or 25th he made renewed attempts to recapture it. Again he failed, and with very heavy losses to him as compared with ours. On the night of the 20th our troops on the north side of the James were withdrawn, and Hancock and Gregg were sent south to destroy the Weldon Railroad. They were attacked on the 25th at Reams's Station, and after desperate fighting a part of our line gave way, losing 5 pieces of artillery. But the Weldon Railroad never went out of our possession from the 18th of August to the close of the war. End of Section 57. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at joclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 58. Sheridan's Advance. Visit to Sheridan. Sheridan's Victory in the Shenandoah. Sheridan's Ride to Winchester. Close of the campaign for the winter. We had our troops on the Weldon Railroad contending against a large force that regarded this road of so much importance that they could afford to expend many lives in retaking it. Sherman just getting through to Atlanta with great losses of men from casualties, discharges and detachments left along as guards to occupy and hold the road in rear of him. Washington threatened but a short time before, and now Early being strengthened in the valley so as, probably, to renew that attempt, it kept me pretty active in looking after all these points. On the 10th of August, Sheridan had advanced on Early up the Shenandoah Valley, Early falling back to Strasburg. On the 12th I learned that Lee had sent 20 pieces of artillery, 2 divisions of infantry, and a considerable cavalry force to strengthen Early. It was important that Sheridan should be informed of this, so I sent the information to Washington by telegraph, and directed a courier to be sent from there to get the message to Sheridan at all hazards, giving him the information. The messenger, an officer of the army, pushed through with great energy and reached Sheridan just in time. The officer went through by way of Snicker's Gap, escorted by some cavalry. He found Sheridan just making his preparations to attack Early in his chosen position. Now, however, he was thrown back on the defensive. On the 15th of September I started to visit General Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. My purpose was to have him attack Early, or drive him out of the valley and destroy that source of supplies for Lee's army. I knew it was impossible for me to get orders through Washington to Sheridan to make a move, because they would be stopped there, and such orders as Halleck's caution and that of the Secretary of War would suggest would be given instead, and would, no doubt, be contradictory to mine. I, therefore, without stopping at Washington, went directly through to Charleston, some 10 miles above Harper's Ferry, and waited there to see General Sheridan, having sent a courier in advance to inform him where to meet me. When Sheridan arrived I asked him if he had a map showing the positions of his army and that of the enemy. He at once drew one out of his side pocket, showing all roads and streams, and the camps of the two armies. He said that if he had permission he would move so and so, pointing out how, against the Confederates, and that he could whip them. Before starting I had drawn up a plan of campaign for Sheridan, which I had brought with me, but seeing that he was so clear and so positive in his views, and so confident of success, I said nothing about this and did not take it out of my pocket. Sheridan's wagon trains were kept at Harper's Ferry, where all of his stores were. By keeping the teams at that place, their forage did not have to be hauled to them. As supplies of ammunition, provisions, and rations for the men were wanted, trains would be made up to deliver the stores to the commissaries and quartermasters encamped at Winchester. Knowing that he, in making preparations to move at a given day, would have to bring up wagon trains from Harper's Ferry, I asked him if he could be ready to get off by the following Tuesday. This was on Friday. Oh yes, he said, he could be off before daylight on Monday. I told him then to make the attack at that time, and according to his own plan, and I immediately started to return to the army about Richmond. After visiting Baltimore and Burlington, New Jersey, I arrived at City Point on the 19th. On the way out to Harper's Ferry I had met Mr. Robert Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He seemed very anxious to know when workmen might be put upon the road again so as to make repairs and put it in shape for running. It was a large piece of property to have standing idle. I told him I could not answer then positively, but would try and inform him before a great while. On my return Mr. Garrett met me again with the same, and I told him I thought that by the Wednesday he might send his workmen out on his road. I gave him no further information, however, and he had no suspicion of how I expected to have the road cleared for his workmen. Sheridan moved at the time he had fixed upon. He met Early at the crossing of the Opequon Creek, a most decisive victory, one which the country. Early had invited this attack himself by his bad generalship and made the victory easy. He had sent G. T. Anderson's division east of the Blue Ridge before I went to Harper's Ferry, and about the time I arrived there he started other divisions, leaving but two in their camps, to march to Martinsburg with the purpose destroying the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at that point. Early here learned that I had been with Sheridan, and supposing there was some movement on foot, started back as soon as he got the information. But his forces were separated, and, as I have said, he was very badly defeated. He fell back to Fisher's Hill, Sheridan following. The valley is narrow at that point, and Early made another stand there behind works which extended across. But Sheridan turned both his flanks and again sent him speeding up the valley, following in hot pursuit. The pursuit was continued up the valley to Mount Jackson and New Market. Sheridan captured about 1,100 prisoners and 16 guns. The houses which he passed all along the route were found to be filled with Early's wounded, and the country swarmed with his deserters. Finally, on the 25th, Early turned from the valley eastward, leaving Sheridan at Harrisonburg in undisputed possession. Now one of the main objectives of the expedition began to be accomplished. Sheridan went to work with his command, gathering in the crops, cattle, and everything in the upper part of the valley required by our troops, and especially taking what might be of use to the enemy. What he could not take away he destroyed, so that the enemy would not be invited to come back there. I congratulated Sheridan upon his recent great victory, and had a salute of 100 guns fired in honor of it, the guns being aimed at the enemy around Petersburg. I also notified the other commanders throughout the country, who also fired salutes in honor of his victory. I had reason to believe that the administration was a little afraid to have a decisive battle at that time, for fear it might go against us and have a bad effect on the November elections. The convention which had met and made its nomination of the Democratic candidate for the presidency had declared the war a failure. Treason was talked as boldly in Chicago at that convention as ever been in Charleston. It was a question whether the government would then have had the power to make arrests and punish those who talked treason. But this decisive victory was the most effective campaign argument made in the canvass. Sheridan, in his pursuit, got beyond where they could hear from him in Washington, and the President became very much frightened about him. He was afraid that the hot pursuit had been a little like that of General Cass was said to have been, in one of our Indian wars, when he was an officer of army. Cass was pursuing the Indians so closely that the first thing he knew he found himself in front and the Indians pursuing him. The President was afraid that Sheridan had got on the other side of Early, and that Early was in behind him. He was afraid that Sheridan was getting so far away that reinforcements would be sent out from Richmond to enable Early to beat him. I replied to the President that I had taken steps to prevent Lee from sending reinforcements to Early by attacking the former where he was. On the 28th of September, to retain Lee in his position, I sent Ord with the 18th corps and Birney with the 10th corps to make an advance on Richmond to threaten it. Ord moved with the left wing up to Chaffin's Bluff. Birney with the 10th corps took a road farther north, while Kautz with the cavalry took the Darby road still farther to the north. They got across the river by the next morning and made an effort to surprise the enemy. In that, however, they were unsuccessful. The enemy's lines were very strong and very intricate. Stannard's division of the 18th corps, with General Burnham's brigade leading, tried an assault against Fort Harrison and captured it with 16 guns and a good many prisoners. Burnham was killed in the assault. Colonel Stevens, who succeeded him, was badly wounded, and his successor also fell in the same way. Some works to the right and left were also carried with the guns in them, 6 in number, and a few more prisoners. Birney's troops to the right captured the enemy's entrenched picket lines, but were unsuccessful in their efforts upon the main line. Our troops fortified their new position, bringing Fort Harrison into the new line, and extending it to the river. This brought us pretty close to the enemy on the north side of the James, and the two opposing lines maintained their relative positions to the close of the siege. In the afternoon a further attempt was made to advance, but it failed. Ord fell badly wounded and had to be relieved. The command devolved upon General Heckman, and later General Weitzel was assigned to the command of the 18th corps. During the night Lee reinforced his troops about Fort Gilmer, which was at the right of Fort Harrison, by 8 additional brigades from Petersburg, and attempted to retake the works which we had captured by concentrating 10 brigades against them. All their efforts failed, their attacks being all repulsed with very heavy loss. In one of these assaults upon us, General Stannard, a gallant officer who was defending Fort Harrison, lost an arm. Our casualties during these operations amounted to 394 killed, 1,554 wounded, and 324 missing. Whilst this was going on, General Meade was instructed to keep up an appearance of moving troops to our extreme left. Parke and Warren were kept with 2 divisions, each under arms, ready to move, leaving their enclosed batteries manned, with a scattering line on the other intrenchments. The object of this was to prevent reinforcements from going to the north side of the river. Meade was instructed to watch the enemy closely and, if Lee weakened his lines, to make an attack. On the 30th these troops moved out, under Warren, and captured an advanced intrenched camp at Peebles' Farm, driving the enemy back to the main line. Our troops followed and made an attack in the hope of carrying the enemy's main line, but in this they were unsuccessful, and lost a large number of men, mostly captured. The number of killed and wounded was not large. The next day our troops advanced again and established themselves, intrenching a new line about a mile in front of the enemy. This advanced Warren's position on the Weldon Railroad very considerably. Sheridan, having driven the enemy out of the valley, and taken the productions of the valley, so that instead of going there for supplies the enemy would have to bring his provisions with him if he again entered it, recommended a reduction of his own force, the surplus to be sent where it could be of more use. I approved of his suggestion and ordered him to send Wright's corps back to the James River. I further directed him to repair the railroad up the Shenandoah Valley towards the advanced position which we would hold with a small force. The troops were to be sent to Washington by the way of Culpeper, in order to watch the east side of the Blue Ridge, and prevent the enemy from getting into the rear of Sheridan while he was still doing his work of destruction. The valley was so very important, however, to the Confederate army that, contrary to our expectations, they determined to make one more strike and save it, if possible, before the supplies should be all destroyed. Reinforcements were sent therefore to Early, and this before any of our troops had been withdrawn. Early prepared to strike Sheridan at Harrisonburg, but the latter had not remained there. On the 6th of October Sheridan commenced retiring down the valley, taking or destroying all the food and forage, and driving the cattle before him, Early following. At Fisher's Hill Sheridan turned his cavalry back on that of Early, which, under the lead of Rosser, was pursuing closely, and routed it most completely, capturing 11 guns and a large number of prisoners. Sheridan lost only about 60 men. His cavalry pursued the enemy back some 25 miles. On the 10th of October the march down the valley was again resumed, Early again following. I now ordered Sheridan to halt, and to improve the opportunity, if afforded by the enemy's having been sufficiently weakened, to move back again and cut the James River Canal and Virginia Central Railroad. But this order had to go through Washington, where it was intercepted, and when Sheridan received what purported to be a statement of what I wanted him to do, it was something entirely different. Halleck informed Sheridan that it was my wish for him to hold a forward position as a base from which to act against Charlottesville and Gordonsville; that he should fortify his position and provision it. Sheridan objected to this most decidedly, and I was impelled to telegraph him on the 14th as follows: City Point, Virginia, October 14, 1864, 12:30 P.M. Major General Sheridan, Cedar Creek, Virginia. What I want is for you to threaten the Virginia Central Railroad and Canal in the manner your judgment tells you is best, holding yourself ready to advance if the enemy draw off their forces. If you make the enemy hold a force equal to your own for the protection of those thoroughfares, it will accomplish nearly as much as their destruction. If you cannot do this, then the next best thing to do is to send here all the force you can. I deem a good cavalry force necessary for your offensive as well as defensive operations. You need not therefore send here more than one division of cavalry. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Sheridan, having been summoned to Washington City, started on the 15th, leaving Wright in command. His army was then at Cedar Creek, some 20 miles south of Winchester. The next morning, while at Front Royal, Sheridan received a dispatch from Wright saying that a dispatch from Longstreet to Early had been intercepted. It directed the latter to be ready to move and to crush Sheridan as soon as he, Longstreet, arrived. On the receipt of this news Sheridan ordered the cavalry up the valley to join Wright. On the 18th of October Early was ready to move, and during the night succeeded in getting his troops in the rear of our left flank, which fled precipitately and in great confusion down the valley, losing 18 pieces of artillery and 1,000 or more prisoners. The right, under General Getty, maintained a firm and steady front, falling back to Middleton, where it took a position and made a stand. The cavalry went to the rear, seized the roads leading to Winchester, and held them for the use of our troops in falling back, General Wright having ordered a retreat back to that place. Sheridan, having left Washington on the 18th, reached Winchester that night. The following morning he started to join his command. He had scarcely got out of town when he met his men returning in panic from the front, and also heard heavy firing to the south. He immediately ordered the cavalry at Winchester to be deployed across the valley to stop the stragglers. Leaving members of his staff to take care of Winchester and the public property there, he set out with a small escort directly for the scene of battle. As he met the fugitives he ordered them to turn back, reminding them that they were going the wrong way. His presence soon restored confidence. Finding themselves worse frightened than hurt, the men did halt and turn back. Many of those who had run 10 miles got back in time to redeem their reputation as gallant soldiers before night. When Sheridan got to the front, he found Getty and Custer still holding their ground firmly between the Confederates and our retreating troops. Everything in the rear was now ordered up. Sheridan at once proceeded to intrench his position, and he awaited an assault from the enemy. This was made with vigor, and was directed principally against Emory's corps, which had sustained the principal loss in the first attack. By 1 o'clock the attack was repulsed. Early was so badly damaged that he seemed disinclined to make another attack, but went to work to intrench himself with a view to holding the position he had already gained. He thought, no doubt, that Sheridan would be glad enough to leave him unmolested, but in this he was mistaken. About the middle of the afternoon Sheridan advanced. He sent his cavalry by both flanks, and they penetrated to the enemy's rear. The contest was close for a time, but at length the left of the enemy broke, and disintegration along the whole line soon followed. Early tried to rally his men, but they were followed so closely that they had to give way very quickly every time they attempted to make a stand. Our cavalry, having pushed on and got in the rear of the Confederates, captured 24 pieces of artillery, besides retaking what had been lost in the morning. This victory pretty much closed the campaigning in the Valley of Virginia. All the Confederate troops were sent back to Richmond, with the exception of one division of infantry and a little cavalry. Wright's corps was ordered back to the Army of the Potomac, and 2 other divisions were withdrawn from the valley. Early had lost more men in killed, wounded, and captured in the valley than Sheridan had commanded from first to last. On more than one occasion in these engagements General R.B. Hayes, who succeeded me as President of the United States, bore a very honorable part. His conduct on the field was marked by conspicuous gallantry, as well as a display of qualities of a higher order than that of mere personal daring. This might well have been expected of one who could write, at the time he is said to have done so. Any officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped. Having entered the army as a major of volunteers at the beginning of the war, General Hayes attained by meritorious service the rank of brevet major general before its close. On the north side of the James River the enemy attacked Kautz's cavalry on the 7th of October and drove it back with heavy loss in killed, wounded, and prisoners, and the loss of all the artillery. This was followed up by an attack on our intrenched infantry line, but was repulsed with severe slaughter. On the 13th a reconnoissance was sent out by General Butler with a view to drive the enemy from some new works he was constructing, which resulted in heavy loss to us. On the 24th I ordered General Meade to attempt to get possession of the South Side Railroad, and for that purpose to advance on the 27th. The attempt proved a failure, however, the most advanced of our troops not getting nearer than within 6 miles of the point aimed for. Seeing the impossibility of its accomplishment, I ordered the troops to withdraw, and they were all back in their former positions the next day. Butler, by my directions, also made a demonstration on the north side of the James River in order to support this move, by detaining there the Confederate troops who were on that side. He succeeded in this, but failed of further results by not marching past the enemy's left before turning in on the Darby road, and by reason of simply coming up against their lines in place. This closed active operations around Richmond for the winter. Of course, there was frequent skirmishing between pickets, but no serious battle was fought near either Petersburg or Richmond. It would prolong this work to give a detailed account of all that took place from day to day around Petersburg and at other parts of my command, and it would not interest the general reader if given. All these details can be found by the military student in a series of books published by the Scribner's Badeau's History of my campaigns, and also in the publications of the War Department, including both the National and Confederate reports. In the latter part of November, General Hancock was relieved from the command of the 2d Corps by the Secretary of War, and ordered to Washington to organize and command a corps of veteran troops to be designated the 1st Corps. It was expected that this would give him a large command to co-operate with in the spring. It was my expectation at the time that in the final operations Hancock should move either up the valley or else east of the Blue Ridge to Lynchburg, the idea being to make the spring campaign the close of the war. I expected, with Sherman coming up from the south, Meade south of Petersburg and around Richmond, and Thomas's command in Tennessee with depots of supplies established in the eastern part of that State, to move from the direction of Washington or the valley towards Lynchburg. We would then have Lee so surrounded that his supplies would be cut off entirely, making it impossible for him to support his army. General Humphreys, Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac, was assigned to the command of the 2d Corps to succeed Hancock. End of Section 58. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at joclev.com. 59 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 59. The Campaign in Georgia. Sherman's March to the Sea. War Anecdotes. The March on Savannah. Investment of Savannah. Capture of Savannah. Let us now return to the operations in the Military Division of the Mississippi, and accompany Sherman in his march to the sea. The possession of Atlanta by us narrowed the territory of the enemy very materially, and cut off one of his two remaining lines of roads from east to west. A short time after the fall of Atlanta, Mr. Davis visited Palmetto and Macon, and made speeches at each place. He spoke at Palmetto on the 20th of September, and at Macon on the 22d. Inasmuch as he had relieved Johnston and appointed Hood, and Hood had immediately taken the initiative, it is natural to suppose that Mr. Davis was disappointed with General Johnston's policy. My own judgment is that Johnston acted very wisely. He husbanded his men, and saved as much of his territory as he could, without fighting decisive battles in which all might be lost. As Sherman advanced, as I have shown, his army became spread out, until, if this had been continued, it would have been easy to destroy it in detail. I know that both Sherman and I were rejoiced when we heard of the change. Hood was unquestionably a brave, gallant soldier, and not destitute of ability; but unfortunately his policy was to fight the enemy wherever he saw him, without thinking much of the consequences of defeat. In his speeches Mr. Davis denounced Governor Brown of Georgia and General Johnston in unmeasured terms, even insinuating that their loyalty to the Southern cause was doubtful. So far as General Johnston is concerned, I think Davis did him a great injustice in this particular. I had known the general before the war, and strongly believed it would be impossible for him to accept a high commission for the purpose of betraying the cause he had espoused. There, as I have said, I think that his policy was the best one that could have been pursued by the whole South: protract the war, which was all that was necessary to enable them to gain recognition in the end. The North was already growing weary, as the South evidently was also, but with this difference: in the North the people governed, and could stop hostilities whenever they chose to stop supplies. The South was a military camp, controlled absolutely by the government, with soldiers to back it, and the war could have been protracted, no matter to what extent the discontent reached, up to the point of open mutiny of the soldiers themselves. Mr. Davis's speeches were frank appeals to the people of Georgia and that portion of the South to come to their relief. He tried to assure his frightened hearers that the Yankees were rapidly digging their own graves, that measures were already being taken to cut them off from supplies from the North, and that with a force in front and cut off from the rear they must soon starve in the midst of a hostile people. Papers containing reports of these speeches immediately reached the Northern States, and they were republished. Of course that caused no alarm so long as telegraphic communication was kept up with Sherman. When Hood was forced to retreat from Atlanta, he moved to the southwest, and was followed by a portion of Sherman's army. He soon appeared upon the railroad in Sherman's rear, and with his whole army began destroying the road. At the same time also the work was begun in Tennessee and Kentucky, which Mr. Davis had assured his hearers at Palmetto and Macon would take place. He ordered Forrest, about the ablest cavalry general in the South, north for this purpose, and Forrest and Wheeler carried out their orders with more or less destruction, occasionally picking up a garrison. Forrest indeed performed the very remarkable feat of capturing, with cavalry, 2 gunboats and a number of transports, something the accomplishment of which is very hard to account for. Hood's army had been weakened by Governor Brown's withdrawing the Georgia State troops for the purpose of gathering in the season's crops for the use of the people and for the use of the army. This not only depleted Hood's forces, but it served a most excellent purpose in gathering in supplies of food and forage for the use of our army in its subsequent march. Sherman was obliged to push on with his force, and go himself with portions of it hither and thither, until it was clearly demonstrated to him that with the army he then had it would be impossible to hold the line from Atlanta back and leave him any force whatever with which to take the offensive. Had that plan been adhered to, very large reinforcements would have been necessary, and Mr. Davis's prediction of the destruction of the army would have been realized, or else Sherman would have been obliged to make a successful retreat, which Mr. Davis said in his speeches would prove more disastrous than Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. These speeches of Mr. Davis were not long in reaching Sherman. He took advantage of the information they gave, and made all the preparation possible for him to make to meet what now became expected, attempts to break his communications. Something else had to be done, and to Sherman's sensible and soldierly mind the idea was not long in dawning upon him, not only that something else had to be done, but what that something else should be. On September 10th I telegraphed Sherman as follows: City Point, Virginia, September 10, 1864. Major General Sherman, Atlanta, Georgia. So soon as your men are sufficiently rested and preparations can be made, it is desirable that another campaign should be commenced. We want to keep the enemy constantly pressed to the end of the war. If we give him no peace whilst the war lasts, the end cannot be distant. Now that we have all of Mobile Bay that is valuable, I do not know but it will be the best move to transfer Canby's troops to act upon Savannah, whilst you move on Augusta. I should like to hear from you, however, in this matter. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Sherman replied promptly: "If I could be sure of finding provisions and ammunition at Augusta or Columbus, Georgia, I could march to Milledgeville and compel Hood to give up Augusta or Macon, and then turn on the other. If you can manage to take the Savannah River as high up as Augusta, or the Chattahoochee as far up as Columbus, I can sweep the whole State of Georgia." On the 12th I sent a special messenger, one of my own staff, with a letter inviting Sherman's views about the next campaign. City Point, Virginia, September 12, 1864. Major General W. T. Sherman, commanding Mill Division of the Mississippi. I sent Lieutenant Colonel Porter of my staff with this. Colonel Porter will explain to you the exact condition of affairs here better than I can do in the limits of a letter. Although I feel myself strong enough for offensive operations, I am holding on quietly to get advantage of recruits and convalescents, who are coming forward very rapidly. My lines are necessarily very long, extending from Deep Bottom north of the James, across the peninsula formed by the Appomattox and the James, and south of the Appomattox to the Weldon Road. This line is very strongly fortified, and can be held with comparatively few men, but from its great length takes many in the aggregate. I propose, when I do move, to extend my left so as to control what is known as the South Side or Lynchburg and Petersburg Road, then, if possible, to keep the Danville Road cut. At the same time this move is made, I want to send a force of from 6,000 to 10,000 men against Wilmington. The way I propose to do this is to land the men north of Fort Fisher and hold that point. At the same time a large naval fleet will be assembled there, and the ironclads will run the batteries as they did at Mobile. This will give us the same control of the harbor of Wilmington that we now have of the harbor of Mobile. What you are to do with the forces at your command I do not see. The difficulties of supplying your army, except when you are constantly moving, beyond where you are, I plainly see. If it had not been for Price's movements, Canby would have sent 12,000 more men to Mobile. From your command on the Mississippi an equal number could have been taken. With these forces my idea would have been to divide them, sending one half to Mobile and the other half to Savannah. You could then move as proposed in your telegram, so as to threaten Macon and Augusta equally. Whichever was abandoned by the enemy, you could take and open up a new base of supplies. My object now in sending a staff officer is not so much to suggest operations for you, as to get your views and have plans matured by the time everything can be got ready. It will probably be the 5th of October before any of the plans herein indicated will be executed. If you have any promotions to recommend, send the names forward and I will approve them. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. This reached Sherman on September 20th. On the 25th of September, Sherman reported to Washington that Hood's troops were in his rear. He had provided against this by sending a division to Chattanooga and a division to Rome, Georgia, which was in the rear of Hood, supposing that Hood would fall back in the direction from which he had come to reach the railroad. At the same time, Sherman and Hood kept up a correspondence relative to the exchange of prisoners, the treatment of citizens, and other matters suitable to be arranged between hostile commanders in the field. On the 27th of September I telegraphed Sherman as follows: City Point, Virginia, September 27, 1864, 10:30 A.M. Major General Sherman: I have directed all recruits and new troops from the Western States to be sent to Nashville to receive their further orders from you. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. On the 29th Sherman sent Thomas back to Chattanooga and afterwards to Nashville with another division, Morgan's, of the advanced army. Sherman then suggested that, when he was prepared, his movements should take place against Milledgeville and then to Savannah. His expectation at that time was to make this movement as soon as he could get up his supplies. Hood was moving in his own country, and was moving light, so that he could make 2 miles to Sherman's 1. He depended upon the country to gather his supplies, and so was not affected by delays. As I have said, until this unexpected state of affairs happened, Mobile had been looked upon as the objective point of Sherman's army. It had been a favorite move of mine from 1862, when I first suggested to the then Commander-in-Chief that the troops in Louisiana, instead of frittering away their time in the Trans-Mississippi, should move against Mobile. I recommended this from time to time until I came into command of the army the last of March, 1864. Having the power in my own hands, I now ordered the concentration of supplies, stores, and troops in the Department of the Gulf about New Orleans, with a view to a move against Mobile, in support of and in conjunction with the other armies operating in the field. Before I came into command, these troops had been scattered over the Trans-Mississippi Department in such a way that they could not be, or were not, gotten back in time to take any part in the original movement. Hence the consideration which had caused Mobile to be selected as the objective point for Sherman's army to find his next base of supplies, after having cut loose from Atlanta, no longer existed. General G. M. Dodge, an exceedingly efficient officer, having been badly wounded, had to leave the army about the 1st of October. He was in command of 2 divisions of the 16th Corps, consolidated into one. Sherman then divided his army into the right and left wings, the right commanded by General O. O. Howard, and the left by General Slocum. General Dodge's 2 divisions were assigned, one to each of these wings. Howard's command embraced the 15th and 17th corps, and Slocum's the 14th and 20th corps, commanded by General Jeff C. Davis and A. S. Williams. Generals Logan and Blair commanded the two corps composing the right wing. About this time they left to take part in the presidential election which took place that year, leaving their corps to Osterhaus and Ransom. I have no doubt that their leaving was at the earnest solicitation of the War Department. General Blair got back in time to resume his command and to proceed with it throughout the march to the sea and back to the grand review at Washington. General Logan did not return to his command until after it reached Savannah. Logan felt very much aggrieved at the transfer of General Howard from that portion of the Army of the Potomac which was then with the Western Army to the command of the Army of the Tennessee, with which army General Logan had served from the Battle of Belmont to the fall of Atlanta, having passed successfully through all grades from colonel commanding a regiment to general commanding a brigade, division, and army corps, until upon the death of McPherson the command of the entire Army of the Tennessee devolved upon him in the midst of a hotly contested battle. He conceived that he had done his full duty as commander in that engagement, and I can bear testimony from personal observation that he had proved himself fully equal to all the lower positions which he had occupied as a soldier. I will not pretend to question the motive which actuated Sherman in taking an officer from another army to supersede General Logan. I have no doubt whatever that he did this for what he considered would be to the good of the service, which was more important than that the personal feelings of any individual should not be aggrieved, though I doubt whether he had an officer with him who could have filled the place as Logan would have done. Differences of opinion must exist between the best of friends as to policies in war and of judgment as to men's fitness. The officer who has the command, however, should be allowed to judge of the fitness of the officers under him, unless he is very manifestly wrong. Sherman's army, after all the depletions, numbered about 60,000 effective men. All weak men had been left to hold the rear, and those remaining were not only well men, but strong and hearty, so that he had 60,000 as good soldiers as ever trod the earth, better than any European soldiers, because they not only worked like a machine, but the machine thought. European armies know very little what they are fighting for, and care less. Included in these 60,000 troops there were two small divisions of cavalry, numbering altogether about 4,000 men. Hood had about 35,000 to 40,000 men, independent of Forrest, whose forces were operating in Tennessee and Kentucky as Mr. Davis had promised they should. This part of Mr. Davis's military plan was admirable and promised the best results of anything he could have done, according to my judgment. I say this because I have criticized his military judgment in the removal of Johnston and also in the appointment of Hood. I am aware, however, that there was high feeling existing at that time between Davis and his subordinate, whom I regarded as one of his ablest lieutenants. On the 5th of October the railroad back from Atlanta was again very badly broken, Hood having got on the track with his army. Sherman saw after night, from a high point, the road burning for miles. The defence of the railroad by our troops was very gallant, but they could not hold points between their entrenched positions against Hood's whole army. In fact, they made no attempt to do so, but generally the entrenched positions were held, as well as important bridges and store located at them. Allatoona, for instance, was defended by a small force of men under the command of General Corse, one of the very able and efficient volunteer officers produced by the war. He, with a small force, was cut off from the remainder of the National army and was attacked with great vigor by many times his own number. Sherman, from his high position, could see the battle raging, with the Confederate troops between him and his subordinate. He sent men, of course, to raise the temporary siege, but the time that would be necessarily consumed in reaching Corse would be so great that all occupying the intrenchments might be dead. Corse was a man who would never surrender. From a high position some of Sherman's signal corps discovered a signal flag waving from a hole in the blockhouse at Allatoona. It was from Corse. He had been shot through the face, but he signaled to his chief a message which left no doubt of his determination to hold his post at all hazards. It was at this point probably that Sherman first realized that with the forces at his disposal, the keeping open of his line of communication with the North would be impossible if he expected to retain any force with which to operate offensively beyond Atlanta. He proposed, therefore, to destroy the roads back to Chattanooga when all ready to move, and leave the latter place garrisoned. Yet before abandoning the railroad, it was necessary that he should repair damages already done, and hold the road until he could get forward such supplies, ordnance stores, and small rations as he wanted to carry with him on his proposed march, and to return to the North his surplus artillery, his object being to move light and to have no more artillery than could be used to advantage on the field. Sherman thought Hood would follow him, though he proposed to prepare for the contingency of the latter moving the other way while he was moving south, by making Thomas strong enough to hold Tennessee and Kentucky. I myself was thoroughly satisfied that Hood would go north, as he did. On the 2d of November I telegraphed Sherman, authorizing him definitely to move according to the plan he had proposed, that is, cutting loose from his base, giving up Atlanta and the railroad back to Chattanooga. To strengthen Thomas, he sent Stanley, 4th Corps, back, and also ordered Schofield, commanding the Army of the Ohio, 12,000 strong, to report to him. In addition to this, A.J. Smith, who, with 2 divisions of Sherman's army, was in Missouri aiding Rosecrans in driving the enemy from that State, was under orders to return to Thomas and, under the most unfavorable circumstances, might be expected to arrive there long before Hood could reach Nashville. In addition to this, the new levies of troops that were being raised in the Northwest went to Thomas as rapidly as enrolled and equipped. Thomas, without any of these additions spoken of, had a garrison at Chattanooga, which had been strengthened by 1 division, and garrisons at Bridgeport, Stevenson, Decatur, Murfreesboro, and Florence. There were already with him in Nashville 10,000 soldiers in round numbers, and many thousands of employees in the quartermasters and other departments, who could be put in the intrenchments in front of Nashville for its defense. Also Wilson was there with 10,000 dismounted cavalrymen, who were being equipped for the field. Thomas had at this time about 45,000 men, without any of the reinforcements here above enumerated. These reinforcements gave him altogether about 70,000 men, without counting what might be added by the new levies already spoken of. About this time Beauregard arrived upon the field, not to supersede Hood in command, but to take general charge over the entire district in which Hood and Sherman were, or might be, operating. He made the most frantic appeals to the citizens for assistance to be rendered in every way, by sending reinforcements, by destroying supplies on the line of march of the invaders, by destroying the bridges over which they would have to cross, and by, in every way, obstructing the roads to their front. But it was hard to convince the people of the propriety of destroying supplies which were so much needed by themselves, and each one hoped that his own possessions might escape. Hood soon started north and went into camp near Decatur, Alabama, where he remained until the 29th of October, but without making an attack on the garrison of that place. The Tennessee River was patrolled by gunboats from Muscle Shoals east, and also below the second shoals out to the Ohio River. These, with the troops that might be concentrated from the garrisons along the river at any point where Hood might choose to attempt to cross, made it impossible for him to cross the Tennessee at any place where it was navigable. But Muscle Shoals is not navigable, and below them again is another shoal, which also obstructs navigation. Hood therefore moved down to a point nearly opposite Florence, Alabama, crossed over, and remained there for some time, collecting supplies of food, forage, and ammunition. All of these had to come from a considerable distance south, because the region in which he was then situated was mountainous, with small valleys which produced but little, and what they had produced had long since been exhausted. On the 1st of November I suggested to Sherman, and also asked his views thereon, the propriety of destroying Hood before he started on his campaign. On the 2d of November, as stated, I approved definitely his making his proposed campaign through Georgia, leaving Hood behind to the tender mercy of Thomas and the troops in his command. Sherman fixed the 10th of November as the day of starting. Sherman started on that day to get back to Atlanta, and on the 15th the real march to the sea commenced. The right wing, under Howard, and the cavalry went to Jonesboro, Milledgeville, then the capital of Georgia, being Sherman's objective or stopping place on the way to Savannah. The left wing moved to Stone Mountain, along roads much further east than those taken by the right wing. Slocum was in command, and threatened Augusta as the point to which he was moving, but he was to turn off and meet the right wing at Milledgeville. Atlanta was destroyed, so far as to render it worthless for military purposes, before starting, Sherman himself remaining over a day to superintend the work and see that it was well done. Sherman's orders for this campaign were perfect. Before starting he had sent back all sick, disabled, and weak men, retaining nothing but the hardy, well inured soldiers to accompany him on his long march in prospect. His artillery was reduced to 65 guns. The ammunition carried with them was 200 rounds for musket and gun. Small rations were taken in a small wagon train, which was loaded to its capacity for rapid movement. The army was expected to live on the country, and to always keep the wagons full of forage and provisions against a possible delay of a few days. The troops, both of the right and left wings, made most of their advance along the line of railroads, which they destroyed. The method adopted to perform this work was to burn and destroy all the bridges and culverts, and for a long distance, at places, to tear up the track and bend the rails. Soldiers, to do this rapidly, would form a line along one side of the road with crowbars and poles, place these under the rails, and, hoisting all at once, turn over many rods of road at one time. The ties would then be placed in piles, and the rails, as they were loosened, would be carried and put across these log heaps. When a sufficient number of rails were placed upon a pile of ties, it would be set on fire. This would heat the rails very much more in the middle, that being over the main part of the fire, than at the ends, so that they would naturally bend of their own weight. But the soldiers, to increase the damage, would take tongs and 1 or 2 men at each end of the rail, carry it with force against the nearest tree, and twist it around, thus leaving rails forming bands to ornament the forest trees of Georgia. All this work was going on at the same time, there being a sufficient number of men detailed for that purpose. Some piled the logs and built the fire, some put the rails upon the fire, while others would bend those that were sufficiently heated, so that by the time the last bit of road was torn up, that it was designed to destroy at a certain place, the rails previously taken up were already destroyed. The organization for supplying the army was very complete. Each brigade furnished a company to gather supplies of forage and provisions for the command to which they belonged. Strict injunctions were issued against pillaging or otherwise unnecessarily annoying the people. But everything in shape of food for man and forage for beast was taken. The supplies were turned over to the brigade commissary and quartermaster, and were issued by them to their respective commands precisely the same as if they had been purchased. The captures consisted largely of cattle, sheep, poultry, some bacon, cornmeal, often molasses, and occasionally coffee or other small rations. The skill of these men, called by themselves and the army "bummers," in collecting their loads and getting back to their respective commands was marvelous. When they started out in the morning they were always on foot, but scarcely one of them returned in the evening without being mounted on a horse or mule. These would be turned in for the general use of the army, and the next day these men would start out afoot and return again in the evening mounted. Many of the exploits of these men would fall under the head of romance. Indeed, I am afraid that in telling some of their experiences, the romance got the better of the truth upon which the story was founded, and that, in the way many of these anecdotes are told, very little of the foundation is left. I suspect that most of them consist chiefly of the fiction added to make the stories better. In one instance, it was reported that a few men of Sherman's army passed a house where they discovered some chickens under the dwelling. They immediately proceeded to capture them, to add to the army's supplies. The lady of the house, who happened to be at home, made piteous appeals to have these spared, saying they were a few she had put away to save by permission of other parties who had preceded and who had taken all the others that she had. The soldiers seemed moved at her appeal, but looking at the chickens again they were tempted, and one of them replied, "The rebellion must be suppressed if it takes the last chicken in the Confederacy," and proceeded to appropriate the last one. Another anecdote characteristic of these times has been told. The South, prior to the rebellion, kept bloodhounds to pursue runaway slaves who took refuge in the neighboring swamps, and also to hunt convicts. Orders were issued to kill all these animals as they were met with. On one occasion a soldier picked up a poodle, the favorite pet of its mistress, and was carrying it off to execution when the lady made a strong appeal to him to spare it. The soldier replied, "Madam, our orders are to kill every bloodhound." "But this is not a bloodhound," said the lady. "Well, madam, we cannot tell what it will grow into if we leave it behind," said the soldier as he went off with it. Notwithstanding these anecdotes, and the necessary hardship they would seem to imply, I do not believe there was much unwarranted pillaging, considering that we were in the enemy's territory and without any supplies except such as the country afforded. On the 23d Sherman, with the left wing, reached Milledgeville. The right wing was not far off, but proceeded on its way towards Savannah, destroying the road as it went. The troops at Milledgeville remained over a day to destroy factories, buildings used for military purposes, etc., before resuming its march. The governor, who had been almost defying Mr. Davis before this, now fled precipitately, as did the legislature of the State and all the State officers. The governor, Sherman says, was careful to carry away even his garden vegetables, while he left the archives of the State to fall into our hands. The only military force that was opposed to Sherman's forward march was the Georgia militia, a division under the command of General G. W. Smith, and a battalion under Harry Wayne. Neither the quality of the forces nor their numbers was sufficient to even retard the progress of Sherman's army. The people at the South became so frantic at this time, at the successful invasion of Georgia, that they took the cadets from the military college and added them to the ranks of the militia. They even liberated the State convicts under promise from them that they would serve in the army. I have but little doubt that the worst acts that were attributed to Sherman's army were committed by these convicts and by other Southern people who ought to have been under sentence, such people as could be found in every community North and South, who took advantage of their country being invaded to commit crime. They were in but little danger of detection or of arrest, even if detected. The Southern papers, in commenting upon Sherman's movements, pictured him as in the most deplorable condition, stating that his men were starving, that they were demoralized and wandering about almost without object, aiming only to reach the sea coast and get under the protection of our navy. These papers got to the North and had more or less effect upon the minds of the people, causing much distress to all loyal persons, particularly to those who had husbands, sons, or brothers with Sherman. Mr. Lincoln, seeing these accounts, had a letter written asking me if I could give him anything that he could say to the loyal people that would comfort them. I told him there was not the slightest occasion for alarm, that with 60,000 such men as Sherman had with him, such a commanding officer as he was could not be cut off in the open country. He might possibly be prevented from reaching the point he had started out to reach, but he would get through somewhere, and would finally get to his chosen destination, and even if worst came to worst, he could return north. I heard afterwards of Mr. Lincoln's saying to those who would inquire of him as to what he thought about the safety of Sherman's army, that Sherman was all right, Grant says they are safe with such a general, and that if they cannot get out where they want to, they can crawl back by the hole they went in at. While at Milledgeville, the soldiers met at the State House, organized a legislature, and proceeded to business precisely as if they were the legislative body belonging to the State of Georgia. The debates were exciting, and were upon the subject of the situation the South was in at that time, particularly the State of Georgia. They went so far as to repeal, after a spirited and acrimonious debate, the ordinance of secession. The next day, 24th, Sherman continued his march, going by the way of Waynesboro and Louisville, Millen being the next objective, and where the two columns, the right and left wings, were to meet. The left wing moved to the left of the direct road, and the cavalry still farther off, so as to make it look as though Augusta was the point they were aiming for. They moved on all the roads they could find leading in that direction. The cavalry was sent to make a rapid march in hope of surprising Millen before the Union prisoners could be carried away, but they failed in this. The distance from Milledgeville to Millen was about 100 miles. At this point Wheeler, who had been ordered from Tennessee, arrived and swelled the numbers and efficiency of the troops confronting Sherman. Hardee, a native of Georgia, also came, but brought no troops with him. It was intended that he should raise as large an army as possible with which to intercept Sherman's march. He did succeed in raising some troops, and with these and those under the command of Wheeler and Wayne, had an army sufficient to cause some annoyance, but no great detention. Our cavalry and Wheeler's had a pretty severe engagement, in which Wheeler was driven towards Augusta, thus giving the idea that Sherman was probably making for that point. Millen was reached on the 3d of December, and the march was resumed the following day for Savannah, the final objective. Bragg had now been sent to Augusta with some troops. Wade Hampton was there also, trying to raise cavalry sufficient to destroy Sherman's army. If he ever raised a force, it was too late to do the work expected of it. Hardee's whole force probably numbered less than 10,000 men. From Millen to Savannah the country is sandy and poor, and affords but very little forage other than rice straw, which was then growing. This answered a very good purpose as forage, and the rice grain was an addition to the soldiers' rations. No further resistance worthy of note was met with until within a few miles of Savannah. This place was found to be intrenched and garrisoned. Sherman proceeded at once on his arrival to invest the place, and found that the enemy had placed torpedoes in the ground, which were to explode when stepped on by man or beast. One of these exploded under an officer's horse, blowing the animal to pieces, and tearing one of the legs of the officer so badly that it had to be amputated. Sherman at once ordered his prisoners to the front, moving them in a compact body in advance, to either explode the torpedoes or dig them up. No further explosions took place. On the 10th of December the siege of Savannah commenced. Sherman then, before proceeding any further with operations for the capture of the place, started with some troops to open communication with our fleet, which he expected to find in the lower harbor or as near by as the forts of the enemy would permit. In marching to the coast he encountered Fort McAllister, which it was necessary to reduce before the supplies he might find on shipboard could be made available. Fort McAllister was soon captured by an assault made by General Hazen's division. Communication was then established with the fleet. The capture of Savannah then only occupied a few days, and involved no great loss of life. The garrison, however, as we shall see, was enabled to escape by crossing the river and moving eastward. When Sherman had opened communication with the fleet he found there a steamer, which I had forwarded to him, carrying the accumulated mails for his army, also supplies which I supposed he would be in need of. General J. G. Foster, who commanded all the troops south of North Carolina on the Atlantic seaboard, visited General Sherman before he had opened communication with the fleet, with the view of ascertaining what assistance he could be to him. Foster returned immediately to his own headquarters at Hilton Head for the purpose of sending Sherman siege guns, and also, if he should find he had them to spare, supplies of clothing, hard bread, etc., thinking that these articles might not be found outside. The mail on the steamer which I sent down had been collected by Colonel A. H. Markland of the Post Office Department, who went in charge of it. On this same vessel I sent an officer of my staff, Lieutenant Dunn, with the following letter to General Sherman: City Point, Virginia, December 3d, 1864. Major General W. T. Sherman, commanding armies near Savannah, Georgia. The little information gleaned from the Southern press, indicating no great obstacle to your progress, I have directed your mails, which had been previously collected at Baltimore by Colonel Markland, special agent of the Post Office Department, to be sent as far as the blockading squadron off Savannah, to be forwarded to you as soon as heard from on the coast. Not liking to rejoice before the victory is assured, I abstain from congratulating you and those under your command until bottom has been struck. I have never had a fear, however, for the result. Since you left Atlanta, no very great progress has been made here. The enemy has been closely watched, though, and prevented from detaching against you. I think not one man has gone from here except some 12 or 1500 dismounted cavalry. Bragg has gone from Wilmington. I am trying to take advantage of his absence to get possession of that place. Owing to some preparations Admiral Porter and General Butler are making to blow up Fort Fisher, which, while hoping for the best, I do not believe a particle in, there is a delay in getting this expedition off. I hope they will be ready to start by the 7th, and that Bragg will not have started back by that time. In this letter I do not intend to give you anything like directions for further action, but will state a general idea I have, and will get your views after you have established yourself on the sea coast. With your veteran army I hope to get control of the only two through routes from east to west possessed by the enemy before the fall of Atlanta. The condition will be filled by holding Savannah and Augusta, or by holding any other port to the east of Savannah and Branchville. If Wilmington falls, a force from there can cooperate with you. Thomas has got back into the defences of Nashville with Hood close upon him. Decatur has been abandoned, and so have all the roads except the main one leading to Chattanooga. Part of this falling back was undoubtedly necessary, and all of it may have been. It did not look so, however, to me. In my opinion, Thomas far outnumbers Hood in infantry. In cavalry Hood has the advantage in morale and numbers. I hope yet that Hood will be badly crippled if not destroyed. The general news you will learn from the papers better than I could give it. After all becomes quiet and roads become so bad up here that there is likely to be a week or two when nothing can be done, I will run down the coast to see you. If you desire it, I will ask Mrs. Sherman to go with me. Yours truly, U.S. Grant, lieutenant general. I quote this letter because it gives the reader a full knowledge of the events of that period. Sherman now, the 15th, returned to Savannah to complete its investment and insure the surrender of the garrison. The country about Savannah is low and marshy, and the city was well entrenched from the river above to the river below, and assaults could not be made except along a comparatively narrow causeway. For this reason assaults must have resulted in serious destruction of life to the Union troops, with the chance of failing altogether. Sherman therefore decided upon a complete investment of the place. When he believed this investment completed, he summoned the garrison to surrender. General Hardee, who was in command, replied in substance that the condition of affairs was not such as Sherman had described. He said he was in full communication with his department and was receiving supplies constantly. Hardee, however, was cut off entirely from all communication with the west side of the river, and by the river itself to the north and south. On the South Carolina side the country was all rice fields, through which it would have been impossible to bring supplies, so that Hardee had no possible communication with the outside world except by a dilapidated plank road starting from the west bank of the river. Sherman, receiving this reply, proceeded in person to a point on the coast where General Foster had troops stationed under General Hatch, for the purpose of making arrangements with the latter officer to go through by one of the numerous channels running inland along that part of the coast of South Carolina to the plank road which General Hardee still possessed, and thus to cut him off from the last means he had of getting supplies, if not of communication. While arranging for this movement, and before the attempt to execute the plan had been commenced, Sherman received information through one of his staff officers that the enemy had evacuated Savannah the night before. This was the night of the 21st of December. Before evacuating the place, Hardee had blown up the navy yard. Some ironclads had been destroyed, as well as other property that might have been valuable to us, but he left an immense amount of stores untouched, consisting of cotton, railroad cars, workshops, numerous pieces of artillery, and several thousand stands of small arms. A little incident occurred soon after the fall of Savannah, which Sherman relates in his Memoirs, and which is worthy of repetition. Savannah was one of the points where blockade runners entered. Shortly after the city fell into our possession, a blockade runner came sailing up serenely, not doubting but the Confederates were still in possession. It was not molested, and the captain did not find out his mistake until he had tied up and gone to the custom house, where he found a new occupant of the building and made a less profitable disposition of his vessel and cargo than he had expected. As there was some discussion as to the authorship of Sherman's March to the Sea by critics of his book when it appeared before the public, I want to state here that no question upon that subject was ever raised between General Sherman and myself. Circumstances made the plan on which Sherman expected to act impracticable. As commander of the forces he necessarily had to devise a new one which would give more promise of success. Consequently, he recommended the destruction of the railroad back to Chattanooga, and that he should be authorized then to move, as he did, from Atlanta forward. His suggestions were finally approved, although they did not immediately find favor in Washington. Even when it came to the time of starting, the greatest apprehension as to the propriety of the campaign he was about to commence filled the mind of the President, induced no doubt by his advisers. This went so far as to move the President to ask me to suspend Sherman's march for a day or two until I could think the matter over. My recollection is, though I find no record to show it, that out of deference to the President's wish I did send a dispatch to Sherman asking him to wait a day or two, or else the connections between us were already cut so that I could not do so. However this may be, the question of who devised the plan of march from Atlanta to Savannah is easily answered. It was clearly Sherman, and to him also belongs the credit of its brilliant execution. It was hardly possible that any one else than those on the spot could have devised a new plan of campaign to supersede one that did not promise success. I was in favor of Sherman's plan from the time it was first submitted to me. My chief of staff, however, was very bitterly opposed to it, and, as I learned subsequently, finding that he could not move me, he appealed to the authorities at Washington to stop it. End of section 59. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at joclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant, Chapter 60. The Battle of Franklin, the Battle of Nashville. As we have seen, Hood succeeded in crossing the Tennessee River between Muscle Shoals and the Lower Shoals at the end of October, 1864. Thomas sent Schofield with the 4th and 23d corps, together with 3 brigades of Wilson's cavalry, to Pulaski to watch him. On the 17th of November Hood started and moved in such a manner as to avoid Schofield, thereby turning his position. Hood had with him 3 infantry corps, commanded respectively by Stephen D. Lee, Stewart, and Cheatham. These, with his cavalry, numbered about 45,000 men. Schofield had, of all arms, about 30,000. Thomas's orders were, therefore, for Schofield to watch the movements of the enemy, but not to fight a battle if he could avoid it, but to fall back in case of an advance on Nashville, and to fight the enemy as he fell back, so as to retard the enemy's movements until he could be reinforced by Thomas himself. As soon as Schofield saw this movement of Hood's, he sent his trains to the rear, but did not fall back himself until the 21st, and then only to Columbia. At Columbia there was a slight skirmish, but no battle. From this place Schofield then retreated to Franklin. He had sent his wagons in advance, and Stanley had gone with them with 2 divisions to protect them. Cheatham's corps of Hood's army pursued the wagon train and went into camp at Spring Hill for the night of the 29th. Schofield, retreating from Columbia on the 29th, passed Spring Hill, where Cheatham was bivouacked, during the night without molestation, though within half a mile of where the Confederates were encamped. On the morning of the 30th he had arrived at Franklin. Hood followed closely and reached Franklin in time to make an attack the same day. The fight was very desperate and sanguinary. The Confederate generals led their men in the repeated charges, and the loss among them was of unusual proportions. This fighting continued with great severity until long after the night closed in, when the Confederates drew off. General Stanley, who commanded 2 divisions of the Union troops and whose troops bore the brunt of the battle, was wounded in the fight, but maintained his position. The enemy's loss at Franklin, according to Thomas's report, was 1,750 buried upon the field by our troops, 3,800 in the hospital, and 702 prisoners besides. Schofield's loss, as officially reported, was 189 killed, 1,033 wounded, and 1,104 captured and missing. Thomas made no effort to reinforce Schofield at Franklin, as it seemed to me at the time he should have done, and fight out the battle there. He simply ordered Schofield to continue his retreat to Nashville, which the latter did during that night and the next day. Thomas, in the meantime, was making his preparations to receive Hood. The road to Chattanooga was still well guarded with strong garrisons at Murfreesboro, Stevenson, Bridgeport, and Chattanooga. Thomas had previously given up Decatur and had been reinforced by A. J. Smith's 2 divisions just returned from Missouri. He also had Steedman's division and R. S. Granger's, which he had drawn from the front. His quartermaster's men, about 10,000 in number, had been organized and armed under the command of the chief quartermaster, General J. L. Donaldson, and placed in the fortifications under the general supervision of General Z. B. Tower of the United States Engineers. Hood was allowed to move upon Nashville and to invest that place almost without interference. Thomas was strongly fortified in his position, so that he would have been safe against the attack of Hood. He had troops enough even to annihilate him in the open field. To me his delay was unaccountable, sitting there and permitting himself to be invested, so that in the end, to raise the siege, he would have to fight the enemy strongly posted behind fortifications. It is true, the weather was very bad. The rain was falling and freezing as it fell, so that the ground was covered with a sheet of ice that made it very difficult to move. But I was afraid that the enemy would find means of moving, elude Thomas, and manage to get north of the Cumberland River. If he did this, I apprehended most serious results from the campaign in the North, and was afraid we might even have to send troops from the east to head him off if he got there. General Thomas's movements being always so deliberate and so slow, though effective in defense, I consequently urged Thomas in frequent dispatches sent from City Point to make the attack at once. The country was alarmed, the administration was alarmed, and I was alarmed lest the very thing would take place which I have just described, that is, Hood would get north. It was all without avail further than to elicit dispatches from Thomas saying that he was getting ready to move as soon as he could, that he was making preparations, etc. At last I had to say to General Thomas that I should be obliged to remove him unless he acted promptly. He replied that he was very sorry, but he would move as soon as he could. General Logan, happening to visit City Point about that time, and knowing him as a prompt, gallant, and efficient officer, I gave him an order to proceed to Nashville to relieve Thomas. I directed him, however, not to deliver the order or publish it until he reached there, and if Thomas had moved, then not to deliver it at all, but communicate with me by telegraph. After Logan started, in thinking over the situation, I became restless and concluded to go myself. I went as far as Washington City, when a dispatch was received from General Thomas announcing his readiness at last to move, and designated the time of his movement. I concluded to wait until that time. He did move, and was successful from the start. This was on the 15th of December. General Logan was at Louisville at the time this movement was made, and telegraphed the fact to Washington, and proceeded no farther himself. The battle during the 15th was severe, but favorable to the Union troops, and continued until night closed in upon the combat. The next day the battle was renewed. After a successful assault upon Hood's men in their intrenchments, the enemy fled in disorder, routed and broken, leaving their dead, their artillery and small arms in great numbers on the field, besides the wounded that were captured. Our cavalry had fought on foot as infantry, and had not their horses with them, so that they were not ready to join in the pursuit the moment the enemy retreated. They sent back, however, for their horses, and endeavored to get to Franklin ahead of Hood's broken army by the Granny White road, but too much time was consumed in getting started. They had got but a few miles beyond the scene of the battle when they found the enemy's cavalry dismounted and behind intrenchments, covering the road on which they were advancing. Here another battle ensued, our men dismounting and fighting on foot, in which the Confederates were again routed and driven in great disorder. Our cavalry then went into bivouac, and renewed the pursuit on the following morning. They were too late. The enemy already had possession of Franklin, and was beyond them. It now became a chase in which the Confederates had the lead. Our troops continued the pursuit to within a few miles of Columbia, where they found the rebels had destroyed the railroad bridge, as well as all other bridges over Duck River. The heavy rains of a few days before had swelled the stream into a mad torrent, impassable except on bridges. Unfortunately, either through a mistake in the wording of the order or otherwise, the pontoon bridge, which was to have been sent by rail out to Franklin, to be taken thence with the pursuing column, had gone toward Chattanooga. There was consequently a delay of some 4 days in building bridges out of the remains of the old railroad bridge. Of course Hood got such a start in this time that further pursuit was useless, although it was continued for some distance, but without coming upon him again. End of Section 60. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com.